Between 1927 and 1942 in Detroit and Brazil. And I'm not going to give you much more intro except for the characters you'll meet in this little bit I'm going to read to you. It's the early 30s. We're still in the Depression, especially in Detroit. It's the dead of winter. Rosa Schimmel is a young radical. She's 19 years old. Smitty is a hard-bitten reporter for the Detroit Free Press. And Harry Bennett, who makes a brief appearance, was the head of employment and security for Henry Ford at the River Rouge factory, and was kind of his enforcer. And almost ran the Ford Motor Company into the toilet. And the other thing that, if you're not familiar with the area, Dearborn is not Detroit. They're two separate cities. Dearborn, the River Rouge factory was actually in Dearborn. Henry Ford kind of he lived in and owned Dearborn, so things went his way there. And it was covenanted at the time, so if you were Jewish or black, or I'm sure there were other people on their list, you could not buy property there, or it was not a good idea to get off the trolley and hang around even. And now it's probably the most Muslim community in America. There need to be women. Women work too in the home, in the factories, some like Rosa in restaurants or hospitals, or plugging wires into a switchboard. And a lot of them who should be out working are unemployed now, and if truly cursed by capitalism, evicted from their dwellings to face this bitter cold. It is freezing. Rosa and her brother Ira stomping their feet in place, breath huffing out in white puffs as they wait for the show to get on the road, surrounded by hundreds of men and a few women in their heaviest coats with collars turned up, their hats pulled low against the wind, ready to march. There's still time to go back, says Ira. He's not chickening out, just going on about how it might get violent and she'll be unable to protect herself. I don't see any weapons, she says. Almost all the men not wearing gloves have their hands buried deep in their pockets, and the flimsy sticks the placards are hung on won't be much in a fight. I'm not talking about us. We're going to Dearborn. Different rules there. I'll be fine, says Rosa. Look at how many we are. She was hoping only for 100, maybe 2, but already there must be over 1,000 crowded into the grass in the park. The Detroit police, that Mayor Murphy says will be their escort, standing in clusters at the edge of Fort Street. Now and again, a streetcar stops at the corner of Downing, and several men jump off without paying the fare. Maybe 1 or 2 cops making half-hearted chase until the chiselers are safe within the cheering crowd. Maybe it was the speech that Foster gave at Danceland Arena last night. Or maybe these are just men with nothing else to do, with no job to report to, more bored and curious than committed to the future. It really doesn't matter. They've come. Joe York, tall and thin and intense, is up at the head of the street with Getz and some of the other organizer. He is a very serious young man, which Rosa likes, but he never really looks at her during meetings. Maybe he's shy too. A group of the men who say they all worked at Ford until recently are singing the song that's been going around, the one that goes to the tune of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. I'm spending my night at the flop house. I'm spending my days on the street. I'm looking for work and I find none. I wish I had something to eat. His family has been over from Chicago only a few years. Rosa's papa fleeing from a deportation order, but long enough to know that winter here is just as cold, just as windy. Soup, soup, they give me a bowl of soup. Soup, soup, they give me a bowl of soup. Albert Getz is shouting over a bullhorn now. The hunger march scheduled to start moving at noon, which passed a while back. People are still arriving. "Are we ready?" calls Getz, a roar of readiness. "Remember, this is a peaceful assembly. We march to the gate, present our demands, and disperse. Let's move out." Another cheer, and the shivering mass of them shift into Fort Road, the police making way for them, the beefy Irish sergeant nearest Rosa and Ira grinning and shaking his head. "You people only done this so we have to freeze our nuts off, right? You think Henry Ford is going to come out and invite you in for tea?" "If all of us shout together," says one of the recently fired auto workers, "he'll at least hear us over the factory noise." It takes a while, so many trying to squeeze onto the pavement at once, and when they actually start to move toward the plant, Rosa finds she is walking alongside Joe York. She knows that his family is Polish and changed their name, as did her own, Schimmelman to Schimmel, but thinks the Yorks are Catholics. Joe, in one of his many direct quotes from Marx, has said that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of a soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people, which seems at once sympathetic and dismissive. Papa still goes to Temple Bethel on Woodard, but only to argue with Rabbi Franklin about what it should mean to be a Jew. "You communists are too sure of everything for a good argument," he tells her, but the rabbi knows that life is mystery. Only a little up the road, they encounter the strange sight of Mayor Murphy standing up in an open car, lifting his hat despite the cold and wind to wish them well. "I'm with you all the way," he calls. Joe York makes a derisive noise. If he's with us, he should be marching. "He gave us a permit," Ira says to Joe York. "A permit to march out of his city limits." "Well, he's done what he can for relief." "Electoral politics," says Joe with finality, "is a dead end." "You don't believe in democracy?" Rosa has only managed to steer Ira to one CP meeting, and he came out complaining that he couldn't breathe for the hot air expelled during the long debates. "You'll see when we get to the Dearborn line," says York. "We've got no permit there. The mayor of Dearborn is King Henry's cousin and owns a Ford dealership, and the chief of police used to work for their service department. When we get to Dearborn, you'll see democracy in action." Rosa, the bickering making her anxious, turns to walk backward and read the placards being held up, the bearers wrestling to keep them aloft in the stiff wind. "We want bread, not crumbs. Tax the rich and feed the poor. Starve in the richest land on earth. We want jobs." There are the usual red banners and signs urging support for the Scottsboro boys, but most of the faces she sees aren't political activists. They're the forgotten man, out of work, out of a home in many cases, shameful at being desperate. The men she sees peeling scraps of half-rotten food off the ground when the Eastern market is about to close, the vendors leaving what they can't sell and won't eat. Rosa was in on the debate over what the demands would be, taking notes. 2 15-minute breaks a day instead of one, a 7-hour shift without reduction in pay, end to the speed-ups, abolition of the graft system of hiring, the right to organize without interference or punishment, and above all, the dismissal of Harry Bennett and his service department of snoops and thugs. Others were to alleviate the suffering of those Ford considers no longer needed and has left unemployed, a lump sum of $50, free medical care in Henry Ford Hospital, 5 tons of free coal and coke handed out for the winter, and an end to evictions and foreclosures. Rosa was thrilled that her idea, no discrimination against Negroes for all jobs in the plant, was seconded by Joe York and adopted by a narrow margin. There are only a handful of Negroes in the party in Detroit, and very few, considering how many of them are now jobless, among the throng moving up Fort Street to the Ford plant. They're supposed to be walking 8 abreast, but that has quickly broken down. The line ahead and behind, now just a jumble of bundle-up marchers filling the road from side to side, a pair of Detroit motorcycle policemen cruising back and forth along the margins. Ira thinks the answer is syndicalism. "We get a union in at Federal Screw," he was always saying when he worked there. "We get a shot at a decent living." Most of his fellow workers agreed with him, but at least one of them went to management, saying Ira Schimmel is a Red. Ira Schimmel is trying to organize, and Ira Schimmel was out on the street. "Chicken sticking meth out," their mother would say to Papa when he'd come home late from a meeting, "is losing head." The marchers have become a powerful river now. Rosa exhilarated to be part of it. So many bodies pushing forward from behind that if you stop moving, you'll be swept off your feet or crushed under theirs. "Democracy," announces Joe York suddenly, having had time for analysis of the problem, "will be vital to the Workers' Republic once we establish it. But for now, discipline, clarity, action." "I'm all for the action part," says Ira, hunched, shuddering, in a coat not nearly thick enough for the day. "If we don't keep moving, we'll die out here." There are men in uniforms lined up in front of the bridge going over the Rouge River. She and Ira follow Joe York, who is pushing his way toward the front of the march. The Detroit police and the 2 motorcyclists are nowhere to be seen now. "You stay right behind me, sis, no matter what," Ira tells her. "Grab onto my coat if you have to." There is a fire engine just beyond the Dearborn police, firemen hurrying to link a hose to a hydrant. Ira's coat doesn't have a belt to grab, and she loses him, now just trying to keep Joe York in sight, struggling to follow him even though he's moving toward the trouble instead of away from it. The first canister sizzles past her ears and hits an older marcher square in the chest, knocking him to the ground as the tear gas starts to spread and rise in the wind. Smitty always carries an oversized handkerchief, good for comforting grieving gun mauls, now plastered over his face as he kneels in the field beside Fort Road, eyes only watering a bit as the wind swirls the gas around and, if anything, sends it back upon the fearless public servants who fired it into an unarmed crowd of no-hopers. Even with scareheads and the usual editorial warning about a red takeover, the Lindbergh toddler will still get all the front page ink tomorrow. The kidnappers, whoever they are, sending a second ransom note just yesterday to up their demand to 70,000 G's. But Smitty is deep in the doghouse again with his editor Fosdick, who spends his evening at the Free Press cooking up the dirtiest, noisiest, freezingest situations to throw him into. Like this. Hundreds of the common unemployed herd around him are picking up or digging up rocks from the field and hurling them with some accuracy at the boys in blue. Smitty was in a similar situation during the Meuse Argonne campaign in the Great War, only then he had a gas mask and an Enfield rifle to protect himself with. The thin blue line begins to buckle just as their brothers in the fire department get the hose working, turning it on the closest marchers and knocking more than a few on their keisters. But the hook and ladder boys don't like the shower of rocks and frozen dirt clods any better than the cops do, and soon the whole official Dearborn contingent are beating a hasty retreat. A huge cheer. Banners flapping, placards held high, the usual ruckus before the Cossacks ride in with their sabers unsheathed. Instead, a beanpole of a kid wearing a beret waves his arms in front of the agitated masses and poses a rhetorical question. "Workers, comrades, what do we do now?" "March on!" cried the army of the unemployed, and begin to hightail it for the bridge, some of them thoroughly soaked with patches of ice forming on their skin and clothing. Smitty holds on to his hat and joins the advance. There is always, of course, a fallback position for the enemy. And as soon as he turns left up Miller Road with the horde, Smitty can see it. More uniformed coppers, plus an equal number of Harry Bennett's plainclothes persuaders, bats, metal pipes, and yes, a few shotguns in hand. Standing atop and below the walkover bridge from the parking lot to Gate 4, with the employment building just beyond it. Count them, two fire trucks with the hoses already loaded for action. This will not end well, thinks Smitty, drifting purposely out of the line of fire, where he can function better as a professional observer and not get clubbed, doused, or shot by the guardians of private property and the American way. There is not much of a conversation when the vanguard of the march come into range of the overpass. More tear gas fired, streams of water unleashed, rocks and chunks of concrete flying in the opposite direction, curses shouted, screaming, some of the defenders of the realm charging forward to bust heads, and now the factory gate opening, and some idiot wearing a bow tie driving out into the eye of the shitstorm. If Smitty's view is not distorted by his stinging, tear-filled eyes, it is no ordinary idiot in the passenger seat, but Harry Bennett. You have to look him in the eye, as Clyde Beatty always says. Clyde is a pal, helps Harry pick out the big cats he keeps just down the tunnel from his office. Always good for a giggle to bring in on a leash if there's a visitor you want to rattle. Mastery, Clyde calls it. But to Harry, that just means fear. They've ignored the chair and the whip, Harry thinks, as he steps out of the car. Let's see how they like the pistol. Rosa can barely see. Her eyes hurt so much worse when they're open. Her cloche hat long gone, her hair crisp with tiny icicles from the first hosing. But she can hear Joe York and the little man with a bow tie shouting at each other. And then rocks come flying overhead, smashing glass and metal on the car, and the man with the bow tie is hit on the head and grabs Joe, both of them going down, and gunshots now, even a machine gun rattling away like in the movies, and somebody pushes her to the ground, and she sees Joe York stand up only to go down again, and he's bleeding. She crawls to him as people all around her, marchers, police, men with metal pipes, fight and run and shout at each other, and random shots now, and screams of pain, not anger, and she is helping a marcher drag Joe away from the fighting, holding him under one arm and backing up, the man doing the same on the other side. And it's awful the way Joe's eyes are open, but his head lolls sideways like he's drunk or asleep, and somebody has come up with a car. Rosa jumps in next to the driver and helps pull Joe in beside her, hot blood on her cold hands. And there are 3 badly wounded men in the back seat already. And the man who is driving manages to turn the car around without running over anybody. A Dearborn policeman slamming dents into the roof with his club, and then spider cracking the rear window before they can start back down Miller. The driver keeps jamming his hand on the horn to get the marchers out of their way, and Rosa rolls her window down to yell, "Wounded! Wounded! Wounded!" taking a hard left on Dix Avenue and then speeding away toward Detroit. Then somewhere a hard squealing right turn, and the door must not have been slammed shut because Joe almost falls out the side before Rosa can yank him back in, with one of the other wounded men beginning to scream hysterically, "Joe's dying! He's dying! You gotta help him! He's dying!" till Rosa has to turn and slap him so he can't make the driver slam into something. The driver keeps the heel of his hand down on the horn, beeping as they go through the stoplights and crossroads without slowing. And there is blood actually squirting, like from a child's water gun toy, out of Joe's body onto Rosa. And she searches for the source, trying to unbutton his blood-drenched coat to find the wound. But first, they jolt to a stop in front of the hospital. Henry Ford Hospital. There are doctors and nurses in white already outside, so somebody must have called. But when Rosa, drenched in blood, yells for them to come get the wounded, they just stand gaping, afraid perhaps, but of what? "Please," she cries to them, "help them, they're so young. The wounded boy in the middle of the back seat who hasn't said a thing but just held his stomach with both hands is barely in his teens. Joe is slumped over in Rosa's arms and she can't move. Some of you must have children, she cries, please. It seems like an eternity. Rosa pleading, the driver out of the car and demanding that they do their duty till they finally give in to the sound of approaching sirens. All right, bring him in, scowls the doctor. And Rosa follows as Joe and the others are pulled out of the car, several Dearborn policemen appearing beside them as they move through reception. Rosa taking Joe's hand once they have him on a stretcher and walking alongside back toward the operating rooms. Have you been shot? Asks a nurse. And Rosa has to think for a second. I don't think so. Then you'll have to leave us. Joe's hand is cold and stiff in hers. She has to peel his fingers off to let him go. She is on her way toward the door, not knowing what to do next, when more wounded, mostly from beatings, are dragged in. Ira is among them, barely conscious, held up by a pair of Dearborn police. That's my brother, she shouts. What did you do to him? The cops ignore her all the way down the hall to a room with 4 beds in it, 2 of them already occupied by bloodied marchers. They dump Ira onto an empty bed, throw his feet up onto it, then handcuff him to a sidebar. You can't do that. What has he done? None of us had weapons. You can't do this. One of the Dearborn cops wearily pushes her back into the hallway before closing the door behind him. Go home, girlie, he says. We've had enough for one day. So fortunately, nothing like that could happen in America today. So I mentioned before the book takes place in Detroit and Brazil. Brazil comes into it, the book starts in 1927, which was kind of the height of Henry Ford's popularity and power and success. And he had just come out with the Model A, which everybody thought, oh, he's still making these clunky Model Ts, and he had to shut the factories down for 2 years and redesign. And 100,000 people signed up to buy one before they even took the sheet off of it, and you saw what it looked like. And it was a great looking car. His son Etzel had done some of the design work, and so it was a huge success. And as often happens with people who are really good at something and everything they touch turns to gold, he decided, oh, I can do anything. And he already, at the River Rouge factory, he owned his own coal mines, his own, places for iron ore. Basically, he owned all the raw materials that came in, and within 48 hours, you could unload a barge of these raw materials, and on the other end, 48 hours later, a Model T or a Model A would come out. It was that efficient. The only thing he didn't own was rubber for the tires. And he decided, oh my God, one of these days, I'm friends with Harvey Firestone, but these British and French, they're growing rubber over in Southeast Asia. They're going to stick it to me. So I'm going to buy a section of the Amazon in Brazil, the size of the state of Connecticut, and I'm going to grow my own rubber. There's a wonderful book by Greg Grandin called Fordlandia. And he started a model community down there, which kind of he wanted to look like a middle American town. Because he wanted everybody on the same page. The people there had to work on Detroit time, so that one little circle of jungle was in a different time zone than the rest of Brazil. He thought, well, people are wasting time going from the bunkhouse to out where they're chopping trees down or planting new trees, so we're going to have time punch machines out in the jungle where they're working. And these guys had to learn how to punch a clock. Many of them who had never had a watch or been on the clock before. You had to wear your Ford ID badge, which was metal, and it was really hot, and so people, where do I put it when I take my shirt off? And it turned out to be kind of his Vietnam. And he just poured money into it and didn't get much rubber out. And at some point, because newsmen were kind of heckling him about it, he said, well, it's not about the rubber, it's about the model community. Basically, this is really about me, because he really didn't care that much about money. He did not live large. He was into folk dancing, and he really wanted to be the person who moved things forward and was right about things. And he wanted to tell people how to live everywhere. Any questions? And that hunger mark, actually was kind of the first big kind of opposition, very, very much grassroots to Henry Ford kind of running everything, and other people in the depth of the Depression getting, laid off and starving. Yes?
Well, it's very easy to see the direct correlation between what we watched over this weekend in Minneapolis, and we've watched our Orange Führer do the same things that that Ford did. I'm just curious, obviously you wrote this long before this is happening, but the fact that it is so prescient, can you please comment on that?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. People watch our movie Lone Star and they say, "Oh, you got, that could happen, yesterday." And I say, "Well, that's too bad, because it's not good in the movie what's going on." And 30 years or whatever have passed, and it's still going on. We're still having, those problems about immigration and the border, and nobody's really solved any of them, or they've even gotten worse. What I've found generally is that no matter what I write, by the time I'm writing it or by the time it comes out, there's something happening in the world that's just like it. So if you write about human beings and what they get up to, that's going to happen. Yes?
How much time do you spend in different locations, like Yellow Earth? Writing about, I guess, Dakotas, do you go there and spend a lot of time to...
A lot of them are places that have been before, and now, due to the wonders of computers and all those kind of things, you can go places virtually. You read the newspapers, so I'm also time traveling in the case of this. So a lot of them are places that I hitchhiked through or went through. In the case of Detroit, I was hired to cover the 1980 Republican Convention, the first Reagan Convention at the Joe Louis Center in Detroit. And that was one of the things that started me thinking about Detroit as a crucible, a place where these big forces come together and, which is a more violent thing than a melting pot. At that time, Detroit was already kind of falling apart economically. A lot of the auto industry had left. A lot of the kind of middle class people had left the inner city. The Republicans realized, this is going to freak out a lot of our delegates. So they put most of them in Windsor, across the river in Canada, and bused them to the thing. So all the restaurants in Detroit that thought, we're going to get a lot of business from delegates, got none. And even beyond that, and I saw this with my own eyes, they put cardboard in the windows of the buses, so as they were driving through Detroit, they wouldn't see the city. And so I said, this was a major part of our country. It was like the third city in some way, and certainly economically and industrially, it was a huge deal, and it had fallen on such, kind of dire straits. So, being there, going back on another trip, I got to see at the Art Institute, there's this incredible mural called, Ford Industry or something like that. And Edsel, who was he's kind of the tragic figure in the book, who was kind of an artistic guy and had a quiet sense of humor. He hired Diego Rivera to come and do this mural. So Diego and Frida make a appearance in the book. And so I got to see that and hear some of the stories about it and think about what it might have meant. And then, you do that traveling of, 3 of the newspapers that were in Detroit. You can get online now. So you can see not just what they reported, but when they reported it. You can, like, within an hour you say, oh, this is the Hearst paper, and this is this paper, and this is the middle of the road paper. And then, unfortunately, the African American paper and the Polish paper, not that I speak Polish, are not online now, but you know that they existed and they're talked about. So there's that kind of traveling as well. I was just saying to somebody that my rule when I'm writing historical fiction, not all of my novels are historical fiction, is 1 week to 2 weeks maximum of research, and then I have to sit down and write some fiction. Research is so seductive. It seems like work, but it's not really. It's actually kind of fun. And so a lot of what I'll do is, okay, here's this section of the book. This is what I need to research to do to start this section of the book. And then you leave, informational gaps. I have to go back and find out, what did the 1927 Ford, look like? What colors did it come in? And there's, that kind of information. I mean, my book, Jamie McGilvery, is, back, at the Battle of Culloden, and there are things written about that, very colorfully, but not the kind of stuff that you could get for 1927 to 1942. Yes?
Can you talk about the difference between writing for a reader versus writing for a
Yeah, there's a question about writing for writing fiction and writing a screenplay. When you're writing fiction, the great thing is that you're even more than an enlightened despot. You are God. If you want the sun to shine, the sun was shining. If you want. I did the Bay of Pigs invasion once, and I had 3,000, Cuban soldiers marching down a dusty road. In a movie, even writing the screenplay, I could hear the costumer saying, "Are we going to see their feet? How many real boots do I need for your shots?" And you have to think about that. And if you're an independent, low budget usually, or no budget filmmaker, you really have to think about that. So. On the other hand, when you're getting to make a movie, you have all these collaborators who have talents that you don't have, and you head them in a certain direction. And I usually say, bring me 3 choices, no more. This is the world I'm talking about. This is the tone of the movie. And the people in the art department tell you what the ship would look like in 1642 if it was a British ship and it was transporting people to the New World. They'll do all that stuff, and then you get to come on and wow, look what they did. I didn't know we had that much money. So there's that, part of it, which is you miss. Sometimes when you're writing is where's the composer? I have to supply the music here, and you realize you have to describe things more. In a screenplay, very often I suggest things. So I always use this example of as a short story, I think, by Raymond Chandler, where a line says, "He gave me a drink of warm gin in a dirty glass." From that detail, you can kind of see the guy's office. You give that to, so in a screenplay, I can give that to a production designer and they'll go to town from there. Whereas in a novel, you might want to describe the furniture a little bit more, there's an old essay, I think it was like in the 1700s, of does a character need a nose? If you think of Dickens, he always describes people's faces, but he describes them in a way that is their name and their face are part of their character. That kind of fell out of fashion, and so, you know, unless there's a point of it, you don't mention nose very often when you're writing about people. You try to, you know, when I started, you know, writing books, people would say, "Oh, this is very cinematic," you know, in the reviews. And then when I started making movies, they say, "Oh, this is like a big novel or something like that." But they, you know, some of them are the same muscles, and some of them are very, very different. You know, so not everybody who, you know, there are very few novelists who write a lot of novels who are also directors. There are some. Yes.
Almost all your films, I think, deal with social justice, have a lot of diversity in them. Long before that was a cool thing to do. Where does that come from in your life?
You know, for me, I think it comes from what interests me. If I'm going to go through the neighborhood, I'm going to talk about what's going on in the neighborhood. It comes from living in a pretty mixed world when I grew up, so seeing lots of different kinds of people, maybe not like you, but oh, that's interesting, and they're people, and you know, you like them or you don't like them, but that's not tied to what they are. You know, there's more who they are in that, and so it's kind of like very often, you know, as a screenwriter, when you get a job and they want you to write something, you want to get as much marching orders as you can from the people who are hiring you. And one of the things that you're trying to do is, what are we ignoring? You know, are they, you know, do we want this to be complex at all? You know, I wrote creature features for Roger Corman, and you know, I put a little bit of political stuff in, but they're kind of machines, you know, and there are certain expectations the audience is going to have when they go to a creature feature. So, you know, I might make the science more interesting, and the bad guys might, you know, be an allegory for what was going on in Vietnam or something, but basically it's about the piranha eating people's feet off. There are other movies that, you know, you realize, oh, you know, this will be more interesting for the actors certainly, but also for the audience if these people are more complex. You know, the early Westerns were good guys and bad guys, you know, black hats and white hats. And then, you know, a few of them started to say, well, what if the guy, you know, has a hard decision to make? Or what if he's a bad guy, but this is a situation where, for personal reasons or whatever, he acts good? You start to get a little bit of complexity there. And just the world that I always saw around me was pretty complex. And then the other thing I think that in the fiction that I write and in the movies that I've made and had control over, I'm really interested in how people see the world, their point of view. And certainly the novels I can use, you know, there's probably 12 people who get at least one section of the book through their point of view. And sometimes, like that chapter, you know, there's two people whose point of view you get, and then you get just a little touch in the head of Harry Bennett, which could be a frightening place. You know, and when you start to see in that way, you're talking, you know, even in a genre movie, you're talking about a different movie. Yes?
Not a current events question, but just about how your creative decisions. I haven't read Crucible yet, but as you were reading that, the first thing that came to my mind was my favorite film of yours, Make One. And I'm wondering if in your mind when you were writing this, if there was any kind of connection or if there was any sort of evolution or fulfillment with what you were exploring in Make One and here.
You know, there was a lot in the 30s, especially, of you know, very one-sided Union stories. You know, and that the Union was always the hero and stuff like that. All my readings of history and growing up in the town where General Electric was, and there was always a battle with the electrical workers. I know it's more complex than that. Unions have their own politics. Matewan came out partly, I was hitchhiking through Kentucky and West Virginia when they were about to have a reform group headed by a guy named Jock Leblonsky was challenging this guy, Tough Tony Boyle, who'd been kind of running a very corrupt union. Taking money on the side to ignore certain things, beating up people who challenged him at union meetings and stuff like that. And I got a lot of writes from coal miners who said, "Boy, buddy, we're having it's awful. We're going to have another Matewan massacre here." And as I looked into that, I realized, oh, this, eventually Tony Boyle had Jockey Oblonsky and his wife and child murdered on Christmas Eve. That did not end well. So Matewan is so far from unionism that Joe Kennahan, the character that Chris Cooper plays, he's got to go so far to even get there into that holler and bring this idea of union that they're almost kind of pure. There's one line in the movie where one of the miners says, "Well, I don't want to have to listen to some hunky from Pittsburgh about what I do or don't do," and that was always the problem with the UMW, is these wildcat strikes and getting people who spent their whole day down under the ground in many different states and parts of the country together. The UAW is just forming. Rosa, who you meet, is a young communist. Some of their best organizers were very left-wing. The Ruther brothers who eventually took over the UAW, they were kind of very radical at the beginning, and then as the 50s came and the McCarthy era came in, they purged all the left-wing people out of the union. Because it was just kind of, okay, you want your union to get support from the government and not get busted, get rid of those Reds. So, because this is Detroit and there's all these working people in different factories, this could be a much more complex union story than Matewan could be. Yes?
I'd like to piggyback off that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that guy in the Ford plan who had that moment last week to say something and he never thought he'd ever be able to say it. But as an 8th generation West Virginian, I just would like to thank you for the dignity and the grace for which you portrayed my people.
Thank you.
We have so many caricatured and stereotyped vision of West Virginia, and my great grandfather died in the mines, no pension given. I'm a living embodiment as a 9th generation West Virginian. So just thought I'd take this moment to thank you for Matewan. It was a beautiful representation of what my people have had to go through over the generations.
Thanks. A nice thing that happened when we first came in to make the movie, we scouted in Matewan, West Virginia, and people there clearly did not want a movie to be made about it. It was not glorious. It was a massacre. It was messy. Now that they've seen the movie and some time has passed, there's a Mine Wars Museum there, really beautifully run, and they're kind of proud of that history, and they're trying to find out more about it. And I'm an honorary member of the UMW local, where nobody's working in the mines anymore because they're closed. That was one of my favorite movies to make, just because of connecting with the people there. We knew we were going to use a lot of people in small parts, speaking parts. They already knew the accent, but our extras caster would just kind of say, "Tell me a story about, do you have anybody?" And I got a lot of stuff that ended up in the movie from people coming in and telling their, growing up in coal camps and stuff like that. And we even ended up having some very talented people working on the crew, in the art department especially. That town still doesn't have a main street that's a road. It's just a railroad, and so it was a real find. And I think there were 56 people living there when we shot, and there's about 37 now. But we go back every once in a while. You gotta like hills and curves if you drive in West Virginia. Anybody else? Yes.
I know you're working on Juliet and Ethel Rosenberg. It's in development. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, I'm not really working on and on it now, I had written a script. It's been around for years. I got to meet the Meeropol brothers, who were the sons of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and they felt like, okay, E.L. Doctorow, that was an interesting book, and some of the other things that have been made, but they really felt like their parents as human beings were not, and they, they say, well, we have some problems with, what my father got into. Their mother basically was too busy being a mom to be involved in anything, and she only was included to put the screws to her husband and hope that he'd cave, because, and one of the prosecution lawyers, when she was executed, said, well, Ethel called our bluff. And even J. Edgar Hoover did not want her executed. So it's an interesting story, and some of it, because I also talk about the prosecution lawyers and the FBI guys and the judge and the Rosenbergs themselves, is these people, this is about point of view, these people in these very tight little worlds of belief that don't really cross over. And somebody had to die. Probably the most effective of the spies had been caught in Europe. He got 15 years in jail. And in America, it was this embarrassment. We gave the Russians the atom bomb, which wasn't exactly true. But it was just like, well, somebody's got to pay. And the, kind of hand of fate went and pointed at the Rosenberg. So it's an interesting, complicated story. And it wouldn't be even that expensive to make, but it's not something people are lining up to finance. So.
We have time for one more question, this right here.
Hello, you mentioned Diego Rivera and that you got to see his mural and take a tour and learn about him. Can you tell us what you learned about him that fascinated you, that you put into the book, and what you had to leave out of the book?
Yeah, you get a little taste of it in the book. He was dead at the time. First of all, Edsel Ford, this major industrialist, son of a major industrialist, but owned 48% of the company, hires him to come and do this mural, one wall at first. In the Art Institute, and he says, well, look around the factories in town, and Diego Rivera got into the Ford plant, and he was just fascinated. He loved machines. Back then, they weren't computers, so you can't see into the thing. You could see all the working parts. He loved the way they worked together. He loved what they looked like. And he had the idea, being a good communist, or trying to be a good communist, that this was going to free workers, that they'd have to work like 3 days a week, and the rest of the time have fun and do creative things. So, he really got into it. And he, at that time, when he was there, Henry Ford was starting to spend a lot of time and effort on Greenfield Village, which is not a museum, but it's a bunch of buildings, and his idea of history was it's not a bunch of wars and dates, it's inventions and how people figured out ways to make life better. And it had just only been around for a couple years, and Ford was very proud of it, and he could see it from his house. And one day he's looking out his backyard, and he calls one of his minions over and says, "Who's that fat guy? And he's been there all day, and hardly anybody else is coming, and I just see him going from building to building to building." And then he said, "Well, I think that's the guy your son has hired to do that mural. Well, go over and ask him to lunch." And they actually had a lunch together. They were fascinated with each other. Diego Rivera was fascinated with auto manufacture and how these things came together, and one thing led to another. And he'd spent a couple of weeks in the factory drawing things. All the workers were afraid he was they thought he was a efficiency expert, except Ford hated fat people, so he couldn't be working for Ford. What's he doing here? And Ford said, "So you paint on the wall?" And he said, "No, it's more his English was pretty good. It's more complicated. Why you have to put this certain kind of plaster on and you have to score it. And I have assistants and we make this, I draw this cartoon small and then they do it big and then you poke little holes in it and then we put it up against the wall. And he said, oh, it's a process. And he said, yeah. And so they realized they had actually quite a lot in common, including the thing that Ford said, I never invented anything. I just build on other things, and Diego Rivera was able to say, well, there's all this Aztec art and, all these different tribes in my country who have their own art, and I'm building on that because we want it to be Mexican. These are not going to be like, the old masters back in Holland or something. It's going to be Mexican. The other thing that I found that was interesting is I don't think it was the Free Press, it was one of the other Detroit newspapers. There's a picture of Frida that she was living across the street from the Art Institute and bored. Her English wasn't very good. She really didn't like America or Americans. Talkies had come in, so she couldn't follow the movies because her English wasn't that good yet. And so she mostly went to the Three Stooges and then would leave when the feature would come on. And it's a picture of her at a very little easel in the hotel room with a very little brush. And down below it says, and Mrs. Rivera dabbles in artistic endeavors as well. And it is really where she did her first great painting. She was pregnant. She decided, I'd love to have this kid, but it will kill me with all my health problems. So she got a doctor to, basically it was an abortion, but it was a forced miscarriage. And she painted this thing that was just off the wall compared to anything she'd done before. It's called Henry Ford Hospital, and there's a bed. And I don't even know if there's a mattress on it, but on the side of it, it says Henry Ford Hospital. And she's on her back, levitated above it. And all these organs are coming out of her butt, including the fetus that she had just given up. And Diego Rivera came back from a hard day on the scaffold at his mural and said, oh my God, you got to keep doing that shit. It was really like, I think this is you. And forget all the other masters you've been thinking about, where am I going to fit in? Just follow that thing. So, it's an interesting thing of, that crazy guy who was trying to get back into the Communist Party and this, mogul having some kind of, great meeting of the minds. Thanks, everybody. So if you want me to sign a book, I guess you have to go downstairs and buy one.
Thanks so much. One more round of applause, please, for John Sayles. New novel, The Crucible, available downstairs. I think there's just a few copies left, so if anybody wants one, grab it now. We'll be doing the signing now, so we usually line up on the